Marcus Chun had always believed that fixing broken things was his greatest talent. Growing up in the industrial districts of New Terra, he'd spent his childhood repairing everything from ancient combustion engines to quantum processors with nothing but salvaged parts and stubborn determination. What he never expected was that his reputation for impossible repairs would lead him to the most dangerous job in the galaxy. The call came through official channels, which immediately made him suspicious. The Draconic Empire didn't usually hire human mechanics, especially not for work on their homeworld of Pyraxis Prime. Dragons considered humans to be little more than clever monkeys, useful for manual labor, but hardly worthy of respect. Yet here was an official contract, signed with the seal of the Imperial Palace itself, requesting his specific services. "You want me to fix what exactly?" Marcus asked the holographic representative who appeared in his cramped workshop. The dragon's image flickered slightly, its golden scales catching the artificial light. "The Princess Zephyra's personal transport vessel," the dragon replied, its voice carrying the typical condescension Marcus had grown accustomed to. "It has suffered a critical malfunction that our finest engineers cannot resolve. The princess herself requested a human mechanic, claiming your species possesses a unique approach to problem-solving." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Dragons asking for human help was like asking a child to perform brain surgery. Something didn't add up, but the payment offered was enough to buy his own ship and escape the grinding poverty of the outer colonies. 3 days later, Marcus found himself standing before the gates of the Imperial Palace on Pyraxis Prime, his toolkit feeling impossibly small against the massive crystalline structures that scraped the orange sky. Dragons soared overhead, their wings casting shadows like moving mountains. Each one was larger than the cargo shuttles that served the human colonies, and their eyes burned with intelligence that made Marcus feel like an insect under a microscope. The palace guards, massive dragons clad in energy armor, barely acknowledged his existence as he was escorted through corridors that could have housed entire city blocks. Everything was built to dragon scale, making Marcus feel like he was walking through a world designed for giants. Which, he supposed, he was. "Human," a voice called from behind him. Marcus turned to see a dragon unlike any he'd encountered before. Where the others were bronze, gold, or deep red, this one's scales shifted between silver and blue, like captured moonlight. She was smaller than the guards, but still easily 3 times his height, with eyes that held curiosity rather than contempt. "Your Highness," the escort dragon said, bowing its great head. "This is the human mechanic you requested." Princess Zephyra tilted her head, studying Marcus with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're smaller than I expected," she said, and there was something almost playful in her tone. "Are you certain you can repair what our greatest minds could not?" "Depends on what's broken," Marcus replied, forcing himself to meet her gaze despite every instinct screaming at him to look away. "Mind if I take a look?" The princess's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such directness. A low rumble came from her throat that might have been amusement. "Follow me, Marcus Chun of New Terra." The fact that she knew his full name and homeworld should have been another warning sign, but Marcus was already intrigued by the puzzle ahead. The princess led him to a hangar that could have launched a human battleship, where her personal vessel waited. It was a work of art disguised as a spacecraft, its hull carved from what appeared to be a single massive gemstone and inlaid with precious metals and patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Beautiful ship," Marcus said, running his hand along the hull. The surface was warm to the touch, almost alive. "What's the problem?" "The navigation system," Princess Zephyra explained, shrinking down to a more manageable size through some kind of shape-shifting ability Marcus didn't know dragons possessed. Even reduced, she was still nearly twice his height. "It fails at critical moments, sending the ship into random jumps through space. 3 of our best engineers examined it and declared the problem impossible to solve without rebuilding the entire system." Marcus nodded, already pulling out his diagnostic tools. "Mind if I ask why you specifically requested a human mechanic?" The princess was quiet for a long moment, watching him work. "Because humans see problems differently," she finally said. "Where we see complexity that demands perfect understanding, you see challenges to overcome through persistence and creativity. My tutors call it primitive thinking, but I believe it's something we've lost." As Marcus dove into the ship's systems, he began to understand what she meant. Dragon technology was indeed complex, built on principles of mathematical perfection and energy harmonics that were far beyond human science. But complexity also meant more points of failure, more places where small problems could cascade into major disasters. It took him 6 hours to find the real issue, and when he did, he couldn't help but laugh. "Your Highness, you're going to love this." Princess Zephyra, who had remained nearby throughout his work, moved closer. "You found the problem?" "It's not the navigation system," Marcus explained, pointing to a small component buried deep in the ship's crystalline matrix. "It's this little feedback loop in the environmental controls. Every time the ship's internal temperature fluctuates by more than 0.03 degrees, it sends a resonance pulse through the navigation crystals. Your engineers were looking at the wrong system entirely." "That's impossible," the princess said. But she was already scanning the component with her own instruments. "Such a minor variance couldn't possibly." "It could, and it is," Marcus said, grinning as he showed her the data. "Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. Your people are so used to complex solutions that you miss the obvious ones." The repair itself took another 2 hours, requiring Marcus to carefully recalibrate the environmental controls to eliminate the resonance frequency. It was delicate work, but nothing beyond the capabilities of a good mechanic with the right tools. "There," Marcus said, wiping his hands on a rag as the ship's systems hummed back to full efficiency. "She should fly like new now." Princess Zephyra ran her own diagnostic, her eyes widening as the results came back clean. "Remarkable," she murmured. "In 8 hours, you solved what our greatest minds couldn't in weeks." "Different perspective," Marcus said with a shrug. "Nothing more than that." But, as he packed his tools, Marcus noticed the way the princess was looking at him. It wasn't the casual dismissal he'd expected from dragon royalty, nor was it simple gratitude for a job well done. There was something else there, something that made his heart beat faster despite every logical reason to be terrified. "Marcus Chun," she said as he prepared to leave, "would you be willing to remain at the palace for a few days? I have other projects that might benefit from your unique perspective." The smart thing would have been to politely decline, take his payment, and get off Pyraxis Prime before he attracted the wrong kind of attention. Dragon politics were deadly even for dragons, and humans who got caught up in them had a tendency to disappear. But Marcus found himself nodding before he could think better of it. "I'd be honored, Your Highness." As he was escorted to guest quarters that were larger than his entire workshop back home, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn towards something far more complicated than fixing broken machines. What he didn't know was that Princess Zephyra had already made a decision that would shake the foundations of the Draconic Empire. As she watched the human leave, she whispered words in the ancient dragon tongue that roughly translated to Chosen One. The die was cast, though neither of them knew it yet. Over the following days, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the world of the Imperial Palace. Princess Zephyra seemed to have an endless supply of technical problems that required his attention, though he began to suspect that many of them were manufactured excuses to spend time together. "Your Highness," he said on the third day, looking up from a communications array that had taken him all of 10 minutes to repair. "This wasn't broken. Someone just switched the polarity on the power coupling." The princess, who had been watching him work with obvious fascination, actually looked embarrassed. It was the first time Marcus had seen a dragon blush, and the sight was surprisingly endearing. "Perhaps I wanted to see how you would approach the problem," she admitted. "Or perhaps you just wanted company," Marcus said gently. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. In the silence that followed, Marcus became acutely aware of how alone they were in the depths of the palace's technical sections, far from the prying eyes of courtiers and guards. "Is it true what they say about humans?" the princess asked suddenly. "That you form deep emotional bonds with other beings?" "Some of us do," Marcus replied carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Dragons are taught that emotions are weakness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're supposed to be creatures of pure logic and power. But when I watch you work, when I see the passion you bring to solving problems, I wonder if we've lost something important." Marcus set down his tools and really looked at her. "What you're describing doesn't sound like weakness to me. It sounds like being alive." The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility. Then, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell, and they quickly moved apart as a group of dragon courtiers entered the chamber. "Princess," the lead courtier said, his tone disapproving as he noticed Marcus's presence. "Your father requests your immediate attendance in the throne room." As Marcus watched the princess leave, he realized that whatever was happening between them was about to become much more complicated. The way the courtiers had looked at him suggested that his extended stay at the palace hadn't gone unnoticed. That evening, as Marcus sat in his quarters trying to make sense of his situation, A soft chime announced an unexpected visitor. The door slid open to reveal Princess Zephyra, but she wasn't alone. 3 massive dragons flanked her, their eyes burning with hostility. Marcus Chun, the princess said formally, and he could hear the strain in her voice. My father, His Imperial Majesty Draconus Rex, has summoned you to appear before the throne. The walk to the throne room felt like a march to his execution. The dragons who escorted them made no effort to hide their contempt, and Marcus caught fragments of their whispered conversations about inappropriate attachments and contamination. The throne room was a cavern of crystal and flame, with the emperor's seat carved from a single massive ruby that seemed to burn with its own inner light. Draconus Rex was ancient even by dragon standards, his scales black as the void between stars, and his eyes holding the weight of millennia. So, the emperor said, his voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder, this is the human who has captured my daughter's attention. Marcus straightened his spine, drawing on every ounce of courage he possessed. Your Majesty, do you know what you are, human? The emperor continued. You are a brief spark of life in an endless night. Your entire species will be dust long before my daughter reaches middle age. And yet she speaks of you with a fondness that borders on obsession. Father, Princess Zephyra began, but the emperor silenced her with a look. The bond between my daughter and this creature cannot be allowed to continue, Draconus Rex declared. It is an aberration that threatens the purity of our bloodline and the stability of our empire. Marcus felt his heart sink, but before he could respond, Princess Zephyra stepped forward. Father, you cannot dictate matters of the heart, even for dragons. I can and I will, the emperor replied coldly. The human will leave Pyraxis Prime immediately and never return. This is not a request. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked at the princess, seeing the pain in her eyes, and made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. With respect, Your Majesty, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins, I decline. The temperature in the throne room dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Dragons were creatures of fire, but the emperor's rage was cold as space itself. You dare refuse an imperial command? Draconus Rex snarled. I dare to love your daughter, Marcus replied, the words coming out before he could stop them. And I believe she loves me too. The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled court. Dragons gasped in their ancient language, and several courtiers actually stepped backward as if Marcus had just declared himself a plague carrier. But Princess Zephyra smiled, and in that moment, Marcus knew that whatever came next, he had chosen correctly. So be it, the emperor said, his voice deadly quiet. If you will not leave willingly, human, then you will face the trial of worthiness. Survive 3 challenges chosen by the court, and you may remain. Fail, and you die. Marcus swallowed hard. When do we start? As he was led away to prepare for the trials, Marcus caught the princess's I won last time. She mouthed something in the dragon tongue that he didn't understand, but her expression was clear enough. The real battle was just beginning. The holding cell beneath the imperial palace was built for dragons, which meant Marcus had enough space to pace for hours while contemplating his rapidly approaching death. The stone walls were carved with ancient symbols that seemed to move in his peripheral vision, and the air hummed with an energy that made his teeth ache. He'd been given 12 hours to prepare for the trial of worthiness, though no one would tell him exactly what that preparation should entail. The dragon guards who brought him food spoke only in their ancient tongue, their eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and pity that didn't improve his confidence. Marcus was examining the quantum lock on his cell door, more out of nervous habit than any hope of escape, when Princess Zephyra materialized in the corridor beyond. She'd used some kind of stealth technology to bypass the guards, her form shimmering like heat waves until she solidified. You shouldn't be here, Marcus said, though he was grateful beyond words to see her. Neither should you, she replied, pressing her hand against the energy barrier that separated them. Marcus, what you said in the throne room, did you mean it? Every word, he said, placing his own hand against the barrier where hers rested. The energy field sparked at the contact, but neither of them pulled away. Though I'm starting to think it might have been poor timing. The princess laughed, a sound like distant wind chimes. In dragon culture, declarations of love before the court are binding contracts. By speaking those words publicly, you've formally requested permission to court me. And your father's response was to sentence me to death, Marcus observed. I'm getting mixed signals here. The trial of worthiness is an ancient tradition, she explained urgently. It's designed to test whether a potential mate possesses the qualities necessary to survive in dragon society. Strength, intelligence, and, above all, the will to endure impossible odds. Has anyone ever passed? 2 candidates in the last millennium, she admitted. Both were dragons from rival kingdoms, and both were expected to succeed. A human has never attempted the trial. Marcus nodded grimly. So what you're telling me is that I'm completely screwed. Not necessarily, the princess said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. The trials test different aspects of worthiness. The first trial tests physical capability, the second tests mental acuity, and the third tests character. Your species may be physically weaker than ours, but humans have other advantages, such as adaptability, innovation, the ability to find solutions that pure logic cannot reach. She leaned closer to the barrier. Marcus, promise me something. Whatever happens in these trials, don't try to be what you think we want you to be. Be human. That's why I chose you. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching guards echoed through the corridor. The princess began to shimmer again, preparing to vanish. Zephyra, Marcus called softly, using her name for the first time. If I don't survive this, you will, she said firmly. I have faith in human stubbornness. Then, she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he'd bitten off far more than he could chew. Dawn came early on Pyraxis Prime, the binary suns casting long shadows across the trial grounds. Marcus stood in the center of a vast arena carved from black volcanic glass, surrounded by thousands of dragons who had come to witness either his triumph or his spectacular demise. The betting, he noticed, was heavily against him. Emperor Draconus Rex occupied a throne that had been moved to overlook the arena, his expression unreadable. Princess Zephyra sat beside him, her hands clenched so tightly that Marcus could see the tension from across the arena. Human, the Emperor's voice boomed across the arena, amplified by some kind of acoustic magic. You face 3 trials. Succeed in all 3, and you will be deemed worthy to court my daughter. Fail in any one, and you will die. Do you understand and accept these terms? I understand and accept, Marcus called back, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. Then, let the first trial begin. The arena floor began to rumble and shift, reconfiguring itself into a complex maze of crystal walls and energy barriers. But this wasn't just a simple labyrinth. As Marcus watched, creatures began to emerge from hidden passages. They were sleek, predatory things with too many teeth and eyes that glowed like stars. Shadowhounds, if he remembered his xenobiology correctly. Pack hunters from the darkest moons of the Empire. The trial of strength, announced the court herald. Navigate the maze of echoes, and reach the center platform before the Shadowhounds find you. Time limit, 1 hour. Marcus looked at the creatures stalking through the maze, and realized that trying to outrun them would be suicide. Shadowhounds were faster than gravity bikes, and could track prey across dimensional boundaries. But, as he studied the maze's configuration, an idea began to form. Instead of entering the maze directly, Marcus began examining the crystal walls more closely. They weren't just barriers, they were part of a larger system, connected by hairline fractures that carried energy pulses between different sections. The dragons had built the maze to be perfectly balanced, but perfect balance meant that any disruption would cascade through the entire structure. Marcus pulled out his multi-tool and began working on one of the energy conduits near the maze entrance. It was delicate work, made more difficult by the sounds of Shadowhounds getting closer, but he'd spent years learning to work under pressure. The first Shadowhound reached his position just as Marcus finished his modifications. The creature leaped at him, claws extended, but instead of trying to dodge, Marcus activated his improvised trigger. The energy cascade he'd created ripped through the maze's power grid, causing entire sections of crystal wall to shift and reconfigure. The Shadowhound's leap carried it directly into a wall that hadn't been there a moment before, stunning the creature long enough for Marcus to sprint deeper into the maze. But his real innovation wasn't the wall manipulation. As the maze reconfigured according to his modifications, it was creating new paths while closing others. More importantly, the energy disruptions were interfering with the Shadowhound's tracking abilities. Their supernatural senses were designed to work within the maze's normal parameters, not during a system-wide failure. Marcus reached the center platform in 18 minutes, having turned the maze's own complexity against itself. The Shadowhounds were still wandering lost in passages that no longer led where their instincts told them they should. The arena fell silent as the implications of what they'd witnessed sank in. Marcus hadn't overpowered the trial through strength or endurance. He'd hacked it. Emperor Draconus Rex's expression was unreadable, but Marcus caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval in the ancient dragon's eyes. The first trial is complete, the herald announced. The human has demonstrated unconventional capability. As the arena reconfigured for the second trial, Marcus noticed the betting odds had shifted dramatically. He was still the underdog, but apparently, some dragons were beginning to think he might survive after all. The second trial materialized as a three-dimensional holographic puzzle floating in the center of the arena. It was a representation of a stellar cluster with hundreds of variables, gravitational interactions, stellar evolution cycles, trade routes, and political boundaries. The challenge was to optimize resource distribution across the entire cluster while maintaining political stability. The trial of wisdom, the herald called. Solve the cluster paradox. Previous candidates have required days to find acceptable solutions. Time limit, for hours. Marcus studied the problem, recognizing it as a classic example of dragon intellectual complexity. Every variable was interconnected with dozens of others, creating a web of cause and effect that would take a supercomputer days to fully analyze. The dragon approach would be to map every relationship mathematically and find the optimal solution through pure logical deduction. But Marcus wasn't a dragon. Instead of trying to solve the entire puzzle at once, he began looking for patterns. Humans were pattern recognition machines, evolved to spot the subtle signs that meant the difference between safety and danger. While dragons saw mathematical relationships, Marcus saw a story. The cluster wasn't just a collection of star systems, it was a living ecosystem. Each planet wasn't just a resource node, it was a community with its own needs and desires. The trade routes weren't just economic efficiency calculations. They were the arteries through which the lifeblood of civilization flowed. Once Marcus started thinking of the problem as a story rather than an equation, the solution became clear. Instead of optimizing for mathematical perfection, he optimized for resilience and adaptability. Instead of creating rigid systems that would collapse under stress, he designed flexible networks that could evolve and respond to changing conditions. His solution was elegant in its simplicity and utterly unlike anything a dragon would have conceived. Where previous solutions had been monuments to logical perfection, Marcus's answer was a living system that could grow and change over time. He finished in 2 hours and 13 minutes. The silence that followed was even deeper than before. Dragons prided themselves on their intellectual superiority, and Marcus had just demonstrated that there were ways of thinking that their logical perfection couldn't match. Emperor Draconus Rex leaned forward on his throne, studying the solution Marcus had crafted. "Explain your reasoning," he commanded. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, addressing the Emperor directly for the first time. "Perfect systems are brittle. They work flawlessly under ideal conditions, but shatter when those conditions change. Living systems are messy and inefficient, but they survive because they can adapt. You designed a solution that deliberately includes redundancy and apparent waste," one of the court advisors observed, his tone suggesting this was somehow immoral. "I designed a solution that accounts for the fact that the universe is unpredictable," Marcus replied. "Your mathematical models assume perfect information and rational actors. The real universe has neither." The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying Marcus with newfound interest. "Proceed to the final trial," he said at last. As the arena began its final transformation, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The first 2 trials had tested his capabilities, but the third trial would test who he was at his core. And, unlike the previous challenges, there was no clever solution or innovative approach that would save him. The final trial was brutally simple. A dragon champion entered the arena, one of the Imperial Guard's finest warriors. He was massive even by dragon standards, his scales black as midnight, and his eyes burning with the confidence that came from never having lost a battle. "The trial of character," the herald announced. "Personal combat with champion Vorthak, the Destroyer. The trial ends when one combatant yields or dies." Marcus looked at the creature he was expected to fight, and felt his courage waver for the first time. Vorthak was armed with weapons that could cut through starship hulls, and his natural abilities included flight, energy projection, and scales harder than military-grade armor. Marcus had a multi-tool and a stubborn refusal to quit. "This is not a fair fight," Marcus called out to the Emperor. I'm not asking for weapons or armor. I'm simply pointing out the obvious. Life is not fair, human, Emperor Draconus Rex replied. The trial tests whether you possess the character necessary to face impossible odds without surrender. How you choose to do so is entirely up to you. Marcus nodded, accepting the challenge despite its absurdity. As he walked toward the center of the arena, he noticed something that gave him hope. Princess Zephyra was speaking urgently to her father, and, while he couldn't hear the words, her body language suggested she was pleading for some kind of intervention. But intervention didn't come. Instead, Champion Vorthak launched himself into the air, energy crackling around his claws as he prepared to end the trial quickly and decisively. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He stood his ground and started talking. Champion Vorthak, he called out, his voice carrying across the arena. I have a question for you. What makes a warrior truly great? The dragon paused mid-flight, confused by the unexpected query. In dragon culture, formal challenges often included verbal exchanges, but this wasn't quite what anyone had expected. Strength, Vorthak replied automatically. Speed. The will to victory. I agree, Marcus said, surprising everyone including himself. But I'd add one more thing. The wisdom to know when not to fight. You seek to avoid honorable combat through words. Vorthak snarled, descending toward Marcus with renewed fury. No, Marcus replied calmly. I seek to show you that some victories are more important than others. As the dragon champion closed the distance between them, Marcus made no move to defend himself. He simply stood there, arms at his sides, looking up at the creature that could end his life with a single swipe of its claws. I love your princess, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent arena. I love her courage, her intelligence, her willingness to see beyond the boundaries of tradition. I love her enough to die for her, but, more importantly, I love her enough to live for her. Vorthak's claws stopped inches from Marcus's throat. What are you doing, human? Proving a point, Marcus replied. You could kill me right now, and you'd be within your rights. The trial allows it, even expects it. But would that victory bring honor to your princess? Would it serve the Empire? Or would it simply be the strong destroying the weak because they can? The arena held its breath as Champion Vorthak struggled with concepts that dragon culture had never forced him to consider. Honor was clear-cut in their society. Strength prevailed, weakness was eliminated. But Marcus was offering a different definition of honor, one based on choice rather than capability. I yield, Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena. I cannot defeat you in combat, Champion Vorthak. But I can choose to face that defeat with dignity, and I can choose to accept it for a cause greater than my own survival. The dragon champion stared at him for a moment that felt like eternity. Then, incredibly, Vorthak stepped back and lowered his weapons. The human has yielded, the champion announced formally. But, in doing so, he has demonstrated courage beyond that of warriors who know only victory. Emperor Draconus Rex rose from his throne, his expression unreadable. The arena waited in perfect silence as the ancient ruler considered what he had witnessed. The trial of character has concluded, the emperor said at last. The human has indeed yielded in combat. However, he has also demonstrated qualities that we have not seen in this arena for many centuries. Marcus felt his heart sink, certain that his unconventional approach had failed. But the emperor wasn't finished. Marcus Chun of New Terra, Draconus Rex continued. You have passed the trial of worthiness, not through strength, wisdom, or martial prowess, but through the demonstration of qualities that our empire has perhaps neglected for too long. The arena erupted in chaos as thousands of dragons tried to process what they had just witnessed. But Marcus only had eyes for Princess Zephyra, who was rising from her seat with tears streaming down her face. As she leaped from the royal platform and soared toward him, Marcus realized that sometimes the most impossible victories were the ones worth fighting for. He'd survived the trials, but, more importantly, he'd done so without compromising who he was. The real challenges, however, were just beginning. The wedding planning, Marcus discovered, was somehow more terrifying than facing 3 trials that could have killed him. Dragon ceremonies weren't simple affairs of exchanging vows and rings. They were elaborate rituals that involved ancient magic, political negotiations between noble houses, and customs that dated back to when dragons first learned to manipulate fire. The ceremony of eternal binding requires both participants to undergo the ritual of shared essence, explained Elder Kyrian, the ancient dragon who served as the empire's high priest. His scales had faded to silver with age, and his eyes held the weight of millennia. Your life forces will be permanently intertwined. Should one die, the other will feel that death as if it were their own. Marcus sat in the palace's ceremonial chamber, surrounded by scrolls and artifacts that predated human civilization. Princess Zephyra sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture of support that did little to calm his nerves. What happens if a human and a dragon undergo this ritual? Marcus asked. Has it ever been attempted? Elder Kyrion's expression was carefully neutral. The ritual has never been performed between species so fundamentally different. The outcome is uncertain. Uncertain how? The dragon who undergoes the ritual may find their lifespan reduced to match that of their human partner, the elder explained. Or the human may find their lifespan extended to match that of their dragon partner. Or both participants may find themselves transformed in ways we cannot predict. Marcus looked at Zephyra, seeing his own concerns reflected in her eyes. And you're willing to risk that? I'm willing to risk anything for you, she replied without hesitation. But, Marcus, you need to understand what you're choosing. Dragon lifespans are measured in millennia. If the ritual extends your life to match mine, you'll watch every human you've ever known grow old and die while you remain unchanged. The weight of that possibility settled over Marcus like a shroud. He'd been so focused on surviving the trials and winning the right to marry Zephyra that he hadn't fully considered what forever actually meant when applied to a dragon's concept of time. On the other hand, Zephyra continued softly. If my lifespan is reduced to match yours, I'll have perhaps 80 years instead of 8,000. My father would lose his daughter not to death, but to the constraints of mortal time. Your Highness, Elder Kyrion interjected carefully. There is another consideration. The imperial bloodline has never been mixed with that of another species. The political implications are significant. As if summoned by those words, a commotion echoed from the corridor outside. The chamber doors burst open to reveal Emperor Draconus Rex, his expression thunderous. Behind him came a delegation of dragons whose ornate decorations marked them as representatives of the noble houses. Father, Princess Zephyra began, but the Emperor held up a claw for silence. The noble houses of the Draconic Empire have petitioned for an audience, he announced formally. They wish to present their concerns regarding the proposed union between Princess Zephyra and Marcus Chun. Lord Pyrothane of House Inferno stepped forward, his red scales gleaming with barely contained fire. Your Majesty, this union threatens the genetic purity of the imperial bloodline. Dragons and humans are incompatible species. Any offspring would be abominations, neither dragon nor human. Furthermore, added Lady Crystal Wing of House Frost, her blue scales crackling with ice. This sets a dangerous precedent. If the princess can marry a human, what prevents lesser nobles from forming similar attachments? We could face the dilution of dragon bloodlines throughout the empire. Marcus felt his anger rising, but Princess Zephyra placed a restraining hand on his arm. This was dragon politics, and any misstep could undo everything they'd accomplished. Lord Pyrothane, the princess said calmly, you speak of genetic purity as if it were inherently valuable. But when did our empire last produce innovations that changed the galaxy? When did we last solve problems that seemed impossible? Our bloodlines have maintained their strength for 10,000 years, Lord Pyrothane replied stiffly. And, in those 10,000 years, we've also become increasingly isolated and rigid, Princess Zephyr shot back. We've maintained our purity by avoiding anything that might challenge our assumptions. Perhaps it's time to consider that diversity might be a strength rather than a weakness. Emperor Draconus Rex watched the exchange with interest but remained silent. Marcus realized that this was as much a test as the trials had been. Only now the stakes were political rather than personal. If I may, Marcus said, rising to address the assembled nobles. I understand your concerns about genetic compatibility, but I think you're focusing on the wrong question. Lord Pyrothane's eyes narrowed. And what question should we be asking, human? Not whether dragons and humans can produce offspring, Marcus replied, but whether the empire can survive without change. Your Highness mentioned that your people haven't produced major innovations in millennia. That's not because you lack intelligence or capability. It's because you've eliminated the chaos and unpredictability that drives innovation. He gestured to the ornate chamber around them. Everything here is perfect. Your technology, your society, your bloodlines. But perfection is static. It doesn't grow, doesn't adapt, doesn't respond to new challenges. And, eventually, something imperfect but adaptable will come along and replace it. You suggest that we deliberately introduce flaws into our society? Lady Crystalwing asked, her voice dripping with disdain. I suggest that you introduce variables, Marcus corrected. Unpredictability. The kind of creative chaos that leads to breakthroughs. Your princess chose me not despite my humanity, but because of it. Because I think differently, solve problems differently, see possibilities that pure dragon logic might miss. Elder Kyrian spoke up unexpectedly. The human raises an interesting point. Our ancient texts speak of the time of stagnation, when our empire nearly fell because we'd become too set in our ways to adapt to changing circumstances. It was only through embracing new ideas that we survived. New ideas, perhaps, Lord Pyrothane conceded grudgingly. But interspecies breeding is not a new idea. It's an abomination that violates the natural order. Is it? Princess Zephyra asked quietly. Or is it simply change, and you're afraid of what that change might bring? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could see the nobles struggling with concepts that their rigid social structure had never forced them to consider. Emperor Draconus Rex finally spoke. Enough. The concerns of the noble houses are noted and will be considered. However, the decision regarding my daughter's marriage remains mine to make. The nobles filed out, their expressions making it clear that the matter was far from settled. But Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The emperor hadn't sided with them completely, which suggested that he was at least willing to consider the arguments they'd presented. Father, Princess Zephyra said once they were alone, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, the emperor replied slowly, that the empire has indeed grown stagnant. We've become so focused on preserving what we have that we've forgotten how to grow. He turned to Marcus with an expression that was almost speculative. Human, you've survived trials designed to kill you, solved problems that defeated our greatest minds, and now you propose to revolutionize our society through marriage. Are you certain you understand what you're asking for? I'm certain that I love your daughter, Marcus replied. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. The emperor actually smiled at that. Perhaps that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. But, even as plans for the wedding resumed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were still ahead. The noble houses hadn't given up their opposition, and there were factions within the empire that would never accept a human as part of the imperial family. 3 weeks later, as Marcus stood in the palace's grand ceremonial chamber, wearing ceremonial robes that made him feel like he was playing dress-up, those concerns proved prophetic. The ceremony itself was a spectacle beyond anything Marcus had ever imagined. Thousands of dragons filled the crystalline amphitheater, their scales creating a rainbow of reflected light. Ancient songs in the dragon tongue echoed from the walls, and the air itself seemed to thrum with magical energy. Princess Zephyra was magnificent in her ceremonial form, her scales gleaming silver and blue like captured starlight. She'd grown to her full size for the ceremony, towering over Marcus in a way that should have been intimidating, but somehow felt protective instead. Elder Kyrian began the ritual with words in the ancient tongue, calling upon powers that predated the empire itself. Marcus felt something stirring in the air around them, a presence that was vast and alien, but not hostile. Marcus Chun of New Terra, the elder intoned, switching to common galactic so the human could understand. Do you willingly bind your essence to that of Princess Zephyra, accepting all consequences and transformations that may result? I do, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. Princess Zephyra of the House of Rex, do you willingly bind your essence to that of Marcus Chun, accepting all consequences and transformations that may result? I do, the princess replied, her mental voice resonating directly in Marcus's mind. Elder Kyrian raised his claws, energy beginning to swirl around them in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Then, let the binding begin. The energy struck them both simultaneously, and Marcus felt his consciousness explode outward. Suddenly, he could feel Zephyra's thoughts, her emotions, her very essence mixing with his own. It was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. But something was wrong. The energy that should have been harmonious was fighting against itself, creating discordant resonances that made the very air scream. Marcus felt like he was being torn apart and rebuilt simultaneously. The binding is failing, Elder Kyrian shouted over the chaos. The species incompatibility is too great. That's when Marcus felt it. A presence in his mind that wasn't Zephyra, something ancient and vast and impossibly alien. It was the collective consciousness of the dragons themselves, the genetic memory that connected every member of the species. "You do not belong," the presence whispered. "You are not of our kind. You will contaminate the pure bloodline." But Zephyra was there too, her consciousness intertwining with his, protecting him from the full force of the rejection. "He belongs with me," she declared to the collective. "I choose him, and that choice has weight." The battle in Marcus's mind was joined by other voices, other consciousnesses. He felt Emperor Draconus Rex adding his will to his daughters, and Elder Kyrian, and dozens of others. But there were opposing voices too, noble houses, and ancient bloodlines that rejected his presence with a fury that bordered on hatred. In that moment of chaos, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fighting against the dragon collective consciousness, he opened himself to it completely. He let them see his memories, his emotions, his absolute dedication to their princess. He showed them not what he was, but who he was. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The chaotic energies suddenly snapped into harmony, but it was a new kind of harmony, one that incorporated elements that had never existed in dragon consciousness before. Marcus felt himself changing, his human essence merging with something draconic, while Zephyra's dragon nature absorbed aspects of his humanity. When the energies finally faded, Marcus found himself looking at the world through new eyes. He could sense the emotional currents flowing through the assembled dragons, could feel the magical energies that permeated the palace, could understand the ancient songs that were still echoing from the walls. But he was still human, changed, enhanced, but fundamentally himself. Zephyra, meanwhile, had undergone her own transformation. She was smaller than before, more compact, and Marcus could see human expressions in her draconic features. When she spoke, her mental voice carried warmth and humor that hadn't been there before. "My husband," she said, the words carrying layers of meaning that Marcus could now understand. "How do you feel?" "Different," Marcus replied, surprised to find that he could respond both verbally and mentally. "But still me. Still us." Elder Kyrian stared at them both in amazement. "The binding has succeeded, but the result is unlike anything in our records. You've created something new." Emperor Draconus Rex approached them, his expression unreadable. "The question now is whether this new thing will be accepted by the Empire." As if in answer to his words, cheers began to erupt from different sections of the amphitheater. Not all the dragons were celebrating, Marcus realized, but many were. The younger ones especially seemed fascinated by what they'd witnessed. "Change is never easy," the Emperor observed. "But perhaps it's time we stopped fearing it." In the months that followed, Marcus and Zephyra's union became the catalyst for transformations throughout the Draconic Empire. Their example inspired other interspecies partnerships, led to new innovations in technology and magic, and gradually broke down the rigid barriers that had isolated dragon society for millennia. There was resistance, of course. Several noble houses attempted to have the marriage declared invalid, and there were even assassination attempts by extremist groups. But the changes they'd started proved impossible to stop. Marcus found his new abilities both thrilling and challenging to master. He could now interface directly with dragon technology, understand their ancient languages, and even achieve limited flight through magical enhancement. But the greatest change was in how he saw the universe itself. Through his bond with Zephyra, he experienced the vast sweep of cosmic time that dragons perceived, while she gained access to the intense, immediate experience of human emotion. "Do you regret it?" Zephyra asked one evening as they stood on the palace balcony, watching the binary sun set over the dragon homeworld. "Binding yourself to someone so different from your own species." Marcus considered the question seriously. His enhanced lifespan meant he would indeed outlive every human he'd ever known. His transformation had made him something unprecedented, neither fully human nor fully dragon. And the political complications of their union continued to create challenges neither of them had anticipated. "Never," he said finally, taking her clawed hand in his transformed one. "We've created something new together, something that neither of our species could have achieved alone. The noble houses are calling our potential offspring abominations," Zephyra pointed out. "The noble houses called me an abomination too," Marcus replied with a grin. "I'm starting to think that abomination is just their word for change I don't understand yet." Zephyra laughed, the sound carrying harmonics that Marcus could now appreciate with his enhanced senses. "My father says that you've single-handedly done more to advance dragon society than the previous 1,000 years combined." I just fixed a few problems, Marcus said modestly. It's what humans do. No, Zephyr corrected gently. It's what you do. You see possibilities where others see only obstacles. You find solutions where others see only problems. That's why I chose you, Marcus Chen. Not because you're human, but because you're you. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He'd come to Pyraxis Prime as a simple mechanic looking to make enough money to buy his own ship. He was leaving as something entirely new, bound to a dragon princess, and carrying the hopes of two species within him. The future was uncertain. There would be more challenges, more resistance from those who feared change, more problems to solve. But, for the first time in his life, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The dragon collective consciousness whispered at the edges of his thoughts, no longer rejecting him, but not entirely accepting him either. That was fine. Acceptance, like love, was something that had to be earned over time. And Marcus Chun, the human who had won a dragon's heart, had all the time in the universe to prove himself worthy of it. Years later, when their first child was born, with scales that shifted color like aurora and eyes that held the curiosity of humanity and the wisdom of dragons, even the most conservative noble houses had to admit that perhaps some changes were worth embracing. The Draconic Empire would never be the same. And that, Marcus thought as he held his impossible daughter in his arms while his dragon wife looked on with pride and wonder, was exactly the point. Sometimes the most important victories weren't the ones won through strength or wisdom, but through the simple courage to love someone different from yourself and see where that love might lead. The universe, it turned out, was vast enough to accommodate all kinds of impossible things.